Hey, as Superman01, this is a response to your video Poor Apologetics, the Kalam Cosmological Argument. Let's cut to the chase here. First objection you give, or really you just kind of assert this really, it's not really argued that much, you just argue that God does not follow from the premises. And you say things like, well, couldn't it have been a natural cause? Or all that follows is that this something could create the universe. Now, it's very clear that you have not read William Lane Craig's work on this, in which he does argue for this. Now, the reason it can't be a natural cause is, like, when we say the universe beginning to exist, we mean all the physical reality. Time, space, matter, energy all came into being. So, if that is the case, then by definition, it can't be a natural cause, since the entire natural world came into being at the beginning of the universe. So that's just not a good objection. Yeah, and you also try and say, well, it can't be God. It could just be, I think you used a rhinoceros farting out the universe or something. Well, or a trans-dimensional fairy. Well, that also does not follow, because a fairy or a giant rhinoceros is a physical being, and as Craig will argue, because all of physical reality came into being, the cause cannot be physical. So it can't be a fairy or a rhinoceros, since those are physical beings, and those beings like this are also like spatially located. I have a link in the description section of a debate with William Lane Craig, in which an atheist, brings up a similar objection to this. Just, I know it's a little bit different, but if you substitute computer for fairy or rhinoceros, it pretty much gets the same thing. I think it's a very humorous example as to why that objection does not work. So, yeah, he argues the cause must be timeless, spaceless, immaterial. Yeah, just read Reasonable Faith. Just read his book, Reasonable Faith, 3rd edition. He goes into this. Or you can just read Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. Read the chapter on the Kalam argument, in which he goes into more detail on this stuff. Now, in response to your second objection to the first premise that whatever begins to exist has a cause, you bring up the objection that nothing really begins to exist. And you argue that because everything that we see that really begins to exist is just rearrangements of matter, really. Now, I could give a detailed refutation as to why this is not a good objection, but there's a YouTube user called Time to Think Clearly that posted 7 videos explaining far better than I ever could as to why this is not a good objection. I've also linked his videos in the description section. So I would very much recommend you check those out. So yeah. Now another objection you give to this first premise is that virtual particles come into existence out of nothing, uncaused. Now, Craig has also addressed this as well. Because first of all, virtual particles do not come out of nothing the way the universe did. Rather, as Craig points out, it comes from a sea of fluctuating energy and particles governed by a set of physical laws, so it's not an example of something coming into being from nothing. And also, the interpretation that you seem to be going up on why it is uncaused is what's called the Copenhagen interpretation. And what Craig is siding with, what Craig agrees with, is there's what's called the Boheme interpretation, in which it just says that there are hidden variables, it says that quantum events are not uncaused, that there might be hidden variables to it, and both of these interpretations are equally consistent with the same data. So, I mean, neither one of them is proven. They're both mathematical theories, I believe, to try and explain quantum events, and neither one of them has actually been proven. So what I'm trying to get at is that virtual particles is just not an exception to the first premise. Okay, so that's not a good exception to the premise. And contrary to what I noticed you quoted Victor Stenger, it does not it does not destroy his cause for predetermination, because again, the universe doesn't come into being the way virtual particles come into being. The universe comes into being from nothing, so it can't be just this random event. It would have to be caused, whereas virtual particles, again, don't come into being from nothing, and they very likely do have a cause. Now, in response to the second premise, the universe began to exist, you kind of just say that, well, Craig, he just dismisses the cyclic model, the Hartle-Hawking model, and all these other models that avert the beginning of the universe. Well, again, I would very much recommend you read his book, Reasonable Faith, or the Blackwell Companion, because it just seems like you haven't read those books. If you read his work, he addresses all these things that you are bringing up here. And also, even if you're correct on the scientific models that, that the scientific evidence is inconclusive, you still haven't refuted the second premise. Because what amazed me about your video is that you totally skipped out on Craig's two other arguments. He gives two other arguments for the second premise. One is the impossibility of an actual infinite set of things existing in reality, and since an actual infinite can't exist, then the past can't be infinite. The past has to be finite. And he argues, he uses paradoxes like Hilbert's Hotel to try and show why this is absurd, and that stuff. You didn't even mention that argument, by the way. Now now I'm not sure if it's because you just didn't know about it, or you just didn't feel like mentioning it, or whatever. I don't know, but yeah. You probably might want to mention that argument in a future video, and you also didn't mention his other philosophical argument he gives for the beginning of the universe. You failed to mention the impossibility of transversing an infinite, in which he argues that you can't, that it says that you can't cross infinity. Like if you count to infinity, you will never reach infinity, and basically since the past is. It basically says that an actual infinity can't be formed by successive addition, meaning adding one member after another, and that the past is formed by successive addition, adding one member after the other. And since you can't form an actual infinity by successive addition, the past can't be infinite, because to get to today, you would have had to have crossed infinity, which is absurd. And I know I'm being very brief on this, which is why I'm saying I'm just pointing out these arguments, so you can probably go look them up. Go to his website, Reasonable Faith, which I also have linked in the description section, in which you will, or again, also read his books, read Reasonable Faith, and when he expounds on these arguments. So even if you're right on the scientific stuff, the philosophical arguments still show that the universe began to exist, and it just seems very, yeah. So. Yeah, that's just what I have to say about that. Good luck. Yeah. Goodbye.